On the morning of March 8, 1981, at approximately 9:47 a.m., FBI Special Agent Catherine Brennan stood in the living room of a two-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York, holding a spiral-bound notebook with a blue cover that would, within 6 weeks, lead to the dismantling of one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil. Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. The notebook measured approximately 8 inches by 10 inches and contained 127 pages of handwritten entries in what appeared to be a mixture of English, Russian, and an unidentified code system. Brennan, 36 years old, had been working Soviet counterintelligence cases for the FBI's New York field office for 7 years. She had participated in dozens of search operations, had reviewed thousands of documents seized from suspected intelligence operatives, and had developed an instinct for recognizing when something seemingly ordinary was actually significant. As she flipped through the notebook's pages that morning, seeing columns of numbers, abbreviated notations, and what appeared to be appointment times, she understood immediately that this was not an ordinary address book or personal diary. The apartment belonged to a man named Viktor Leonidovich Petrov, a 43-year-old Soviet citizen who held the position of deputy cultural attaché at the Soviet mission to the United Nations in Manhattan. Petrov had been under FBI surveillance for approximately 18 months, based on intelligence suggesting he was a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. The legal authority for the search had come from a federal warrant issued 2 days earlier on March 6, 1981, by Judge Thomas Morrison of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The warrant had been obtained based on evidence gathered through electronic surveillance, including wiretapped telephone conversations and intercepted communications between the Soviet mission and Moscow that had been decoded by the National Security Agency. Viktor Petrov was not present during the search. He had left the United States 3 days earlier, on March 5, 1981, on an Aeroflot flight to Moscow, ostensibly for what Soviet mission officials described as routine consultations. FBI counterintelligence analysts believed the departure was not routine, but rather an extraction, that Soviet intelligence had detected or suspected American surveillance and had recalled Petrov before he could be arrested. The timing of his departure, coming just days before the FBI had planned to execute the search warrant, suggested either exceptional operational security on the Soviet side or a possible compromise of American intelligence operations. Either way, Petrov's sudden departure had accelerated the FBI's timeline, leading to the search of his apartment while investigators still had legal authority to do so. The apartment itself was located on the 4th floor of a 6-story building on Northern Boulevard, a major thoroughfare that ran through the Woodside neighborhood of Queens. The building, constructed in the 1950s, housed approximately 40 units, occupied primarily by working-class families. Petrov had rented the apartment in August 1979, paying $485 per month, according to lease documents later obtained by the FBI. His neighbors would later describe him in interviews as quiet, polite, and unremarkable. He spoke English with a noticeable accent but was generally understood. He kept irregular hours, sometimes leaving early in the morning and returning late at night, sometimes staying in the apartment for days at a time. He received few visitors and had minimal interaction with other residents beyond polite greetings in the hallway or elevator. The search team that morning consisted of 6 FBI agents, including Brennan, along with two technical specialists who were responsible for documenting and photographing everything found in the apartment. The search had begun at 8:30 a.m. and would continue until approximately 2:15 p.m. During those hours, agents systematically examined every room, every piece of furniture, every drawer and closet. They found what one would expect in the residence of a single man living alone: clothing, books, kitchen supplies, toiletries, a television set, a radio, a small collection of vinyl records featuring Russian classical music. They found correspondence with family members in the Soviet Union, mostly his mother and sister, discussing mundane family matters. They found receipts from restaurants and stores in Queens and Manhattan. They found a membership card to a library on Fifth Avenue and a subway pass. But they also found things that suggested a life more complex than that of a simple cultural attaché. In a locked file cabinet in the apartment's second bedroom, which Petrov appeared to use as a home office, agents found several $1,000s in cash, $6,300 in $20, $50, and $100 bills, according to the inventory report. They found 3 separate sets of identification documents: one in Petrov's name with his Soviet diplomatic passport, one in the name of Michael Rosen with a New York driver's license showing Petrov's photograph, and one in the name of David Klein with a different New York driver's license, also showing Petrov's photograph. They found a camera designed for photographing documents, a Minox B subminiature camera, commonly used by intelligence operatives because of its small size and high-quality lens. They found several rolls of unexposed microfilm and developing chemicals, and they found the notebook. Brennan discovered it in a drawer of the desk in the office bedroom beneath a stack of what appeared to be cultural programming materials, brochures about Soviet ballet performances, schedules for film screenings, information about educational exchange programs. The notebook's placement suggested it was meant to be hidden, but not too thoroughly hidden, as if Petrov needed regular access to it and had chosen a location that balanced concealment with convenience. The notebook's contents would take weeks to fully understand, but even during that first examination in Petrov's apartment, Brennan recognized its potential significance. The pages contained what appeared to be a systematic record of some kind, organized chronologically with entries dating back approximately 2 years to the spring of 1979. Each entry consisted of several elements: a date, a time, a location indicated by what appeared to be abbreviated codes, a series of numbers that might represent amounts or reference codes, and occasionally brief notations in Russian or English. A typical entry from page 47 of the notebook read, June 14th, 80, 1400, CP3 227.50, met, delivered package, next contact, June 28th. Another entry from page 89 read, November 3rd, 80, 1930, location 7, $450, good intel, concerned about exposure, reassured. The notebook contained approximately 200 such entries spanning from March 1979 to February 1981. The most recent entry was dated February 28, 1981, less than 2 weeks before Petrov had departed for Moscow. What made the notebook particularly valuable was not just its contents, but its structure. It appeared to be an operational log, a systematic record of meetings, contacts, deliveries, and payments. If the FBI could decipher the codes and identify what the abbreviations represented, the notebook could potentially map an entire intelligence network: who was involved, where they met, how often, what information was being exchanged, and how much money was being paid. The notebook was photographed in place, documenting exactly where and how it had been found. Then it was carefully placed in an evidence bag, labeled, and transported to the FBI's New York field office, where it was logged into evidence and secured in a vault. Within hours, copies of selected pages had been sent to the FBI's headquarters in Washington, D.C., to the Bureau's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, and to the Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Soviet Analysis. The effort to decrypt and analyze the notebook would become one of the most intensive cryptanalytic operations the FBI had undertaken since World War II. It would involve dozens of specialists working across multiple agencies, employing techniques ranging from linguistic analysis to pattern recognition to cross-referencing with other intelligence sources, and it would ultimately lead to one of the most significant counterintelligence successes of the early 1980s and to the destruction of multiple American lives. According to Petrov's diplomatic file, he was born in 1938 in Leningrad, had studied history and languages at Leningrad State University, and had worked in various cultural affairs positions within the Soviet government before being assigned to the mission to the United Nations in July 1979. His wife, Olga, had remained in the Soviet Union with their adult daughter. Petrov's cover story was that his assignment in New York was temporary, perhaps 2 or 3 years, and that he was responsible for coordinating cultural exchanges and educational programs between Soviet and American institutions. The FBI's assessment, developed over 18 months of surveillance, was that Petrov's actual role was as a KGB officer, specifically a case officer responsible for recruiting and handling American intelligence assets. This assessment was based on several factors: his background, which included service in Soviet military intelligence before his supposed transition to cultural work; his behavioral patterns, which included counter-surveillance techniques such as taking circuitous routes, making sudden U-turns, and frequently checking whether he was being followed; his contacts, which included meetings with individuals who had no obvious connection to cultural affairs, and intercepted communications between the Soviet mission and Moscow that referenced VP in contexts that suggested intelligence operations rather than cultural programming. The decision to place Petrov under systematic surveillance had been made in October 1979, approximately 3 months after his arrival. The surveillance operation, codenamed Red Star, had employed the FBI's full range of investigative techniques. Physical surveillance teams followed Petrov as he moved through New York and occasionally to other East Coast cities. Electronic surveillance monitored his telephone calls from his apartment and from payphones he used. Technical surveillance operations planted listening devices in locations where Petrov met contacts, and analysis teams worked to identify patterns in his movements and behaviors that might reveal his intelligence activities. The surveillance had documented numerous meetings between Petrov and various individuals over the course of 18 months. Some of these meetings appeared to be legitimate cultural affairs activities, meetings with American academics about exchange programs, meetings with arts administrators about performances, meetings with education officials about student programs. But other meetings appeared to have no connection to cultural affairs and followed patterns consistent with intelligence operations. One pattern that had particularly interested FBI analysts involved meetings that occurred at irregular intervals, always at different locations and always with the same basic structure. Petrov would arrive at a location, usually a public place such as a park, a restaurant, a museum, or a library. He would spend time engaged in some apparently legitimate activity, reading, eating, viewing exhibits. At some point, another individual would arrive and would similarly engage in an apparently innocent activity. The two would have what appeared to be a brief, casual interaction, sometimes a conversation that might last 5 or 10 minutes, sometimes merely exchanging glances or simple greetings. Then they would separate and depart. The interactions could easily be dismissed as chance encounters or ordinary social exchanges, but they occurred too regularly, at too many different locations, with too many different individuals, to be coincidental. The FBI's challenge was identifying who these individuals were and what, if anything, was being exchanged during these meetings. Surveillance photographs captured faces, but facial recognition technology was primitive in 1981, and many of the individuals could not be immediately identified. Some appeared to be ordinary Americans, middle-aged men and women, professionally dressed, apparently going about normal activities. Some were younger, possibly students or young professionals. None had obvious connections to Soviet intelligence or to each other. The breakthrough that led to the search warrant for Petrov's apartment came from electronic surveillance. In February 1981, the FBI had obtained authorization to wiretap Petrov's home telephone line based on accumulated evidence of his suspected intelligence activities. On February 22, 1981, at approximately 11:35 p.m., Petrov received a phone call. The caller, a male voice speaking accented English, said only, "The schedule has changed. You need to prepare for departure." Petrov responded, "How much time?" The caller said, "Less than 2 weeks. You will receive confirmation." The call lasted less than 30 seconds. FBI analysts interpreted this as a warning that Petrov was being recalled to Moscow, either because of detected surveillance or because of a planned intelligence operation that required his extraction. The decision was made to accelerate the investigation and to obtain a search warrant for Petrov's apartment before he could destroy any evidence. The warrant was drafted and submitted to Judge Morrison on March 4, 1981. It detailed the evidence against Petrov, including his suspected role as a KGB officer, the documented meetings with unidentified individuals, the intercepted communications, and the recent phone call suggesting imminent departure. Judge Morrison signed the warrant on March 6, 1981. 2 days later, on March 8, 1981, FBI agents executed the search and found the notebook that would unravel everything. The cryptanalysis of the notebook began on March 9, 1981, the day after its seizure. The work was assigned to a team at FBI headquarters in Washington led by Dr. Martin Reeves, a 52-year-old cryptanalyst who had worked on Soviet code systems for the Bureau since 1957. Reeves had a Ph.D. in mathematics from MIT and had spent his entire professional career working on signals intelligence and cryptography, first for the National Security Agency, and then, since 1969, for the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit. Reeves assembled a team of 6 specialists, including linguists fluent in Russian, intelligence analysts familiar with Soviet operational protocols, and cryptanalysts experienced in hand cipher systems. Their assignment was to determine what the notebook's entries meant, what the codes represented, and what intelligence network it documented. The initial analysis focused on the structure of the entries. Each entry followed a consistent format: date, time, location code, numerical value, brief description, and sometimes a note about future contact. This suggested the notebook was an operational log maintained for record-keeping and planning purposes. The dates ranged from March 1979 to February 1981, covering approximately 2 years. The times varied widely, from early morning to late evening, with no obvious pattern. The location codes appeared to be abbreviations, possibly indicating specific meeting sites. The numerical values ranged from small amounts under $100 to larger amounts over $1,000, suggesting they might represent payments. The descriptions were brief and often vague, but sometimes provided operational details. The first breakthrough came from analyzing the location codes. The notebook used approximately 30 different location abbreviations, such as CP3, Lock 7, PP1, MET9, and CENT. By cross-referencing these codes with FBI surveillance logs documenting Petrov's movements, analysts were able to match several of the codes to specific locations in New York where Petrov had been observed meeting individuals. For example, CP3 appeared to refer to Central Park, specifically the area around the Conservatory Garden on the park's east side at 105th Street. FBI surveillance had documented Petrov meeting an unidentified man at this location on June 14, 1980, exactly matching the date of the notebook entry, June 14, 80, 1400, CP3, 227.50, MET, delivered package, next contact, June 28. Similarly, Location 7 appeared to refer to a location in the East Village, possibly Tompkins Square Park or a nearby cafe. PP1 appeared to refer to Prospect Park in Brooklyn. MET9 appeared to refer to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, possibly a specific gallery or area within the museum. CENT appeared to refer to locations in Midtown Manhattan, possibly near Grand Central Terminal or Penn Station. As analysts matched location codes to actual places, they began to build a map of Petrov's operational geography, the places where he conducted intelligence work, where he met assets, where exchanges occurred. This map revealed a sophisticated tradecraft that distributed meetings across New York's 5 boroughs and used public spaces that provided cover for intelligence operations while allowing operational security. The next phase of analysis focused on the numerical values. These appeared most likely to represent payments to intelligence assets. The amounts varied considerably, from as little as $45 to as much as $1,850 in a single entry. The variation suggested they might reflect either the value of information provided or regular stipend payments of different sizes to different assets. To test the payment hypothesis, analysts cross-referenced the notebook's dates and amounts with financial intelligence gathered from other sources. The FBI had been monitoring Petrov's financial activities, including his banking records obtained through legal process and his cash withdrawals. Analysis of these records showed patterns of cash withdrawals that often preceded or coincided with dates in the notebook where payments appeared to have been made. For instance, Petrov had withdrawn $1,000 in cash from his bank account on November 1, 1980, 2 days before the notebook entry dated November 3, 1980, that included the numerical value 450.00. While this was not definitive proof, it supported the interpretation that the numbers represented actual payment amounts in U.S. dollars. The most challenging aspect of the notebook's decryption involved identifying who the entries referred to. The notebook never used full names, instead using only initials or code designators. An entry might read June 14, 80, 1400, CP3, 227.50, met with JM, delivered package, next contact, June 28 or November 3, 80, 1930, location 7, 450.00, RK. Good intel, concerned about exposure, reassured. To identify these individuals, the FBI employed multiple investigative approaches. First, they cross-referenced the dates and locations in the notebook with surveillance photographs taken during Petrov's meetings. If a notebook entry indicated a meeting on a specific date at a specific location, And if FBI surveillance had photographed Petrov meeting someone at that location on that date, then the photograph potentially showed the person the entry referred to. Second, they analyzed the pattern of entries associated with each set of initials or code designators. If JM appeared in multiple entries over time, those entries might reveal information about who JM was, what they did, what kind of information they provided, how often they met with Petrov, how much they were paid. This information could help narrow the search for JM's identity. Third, they cross-referenced the notebook's information with other intelligence sources. The CIA provided information about known or suspected Soviet assets in the United States. The NSA provided information from signals intelligence. Other FBI field offices provided information about individuals under investigation for possible espionage activities. By triangulating these various sources, analysts hope to identify matches between the notebook's entries and real people. This process was painstaking and time-consuming. It required reviewing thousands of surveillance photographs, analyzing hundreds of intelligence reports, and making connections between fragmentary pieces of information. But gradually, identities began to emerge. The first identification came on March 24, 1981. 16 days after the notebook had been seized. Analysts had been focusing on entries associated with the initials JM, which appeared more than 20 times in the notebook, spanning from April 1979 to January 1981. The entries suggested JM was one of Petrov's most valuable and long-standing assets. Payments to JM were among the largest recorded in the notebook, ranging from $400 to $850 per meeting. The descriptions accompanying JM's entries included phrases like excellent material, highly classified documents, technical specifications, and continued access confirmed. By analyzing the dates and locations of JM's meetings with Petrov and cross-referencing with surveillance photographs, analysts identified a man who appeared in multiple photographs taken at different times and locations, but always on dates that matched entries for JM in the notebook. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase. In one photograph, taken at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on August 15, 1980, the man could be seen in profile, and the image quality was sufficient for analysts to attempt identification through FBI records. The breakthrough came when an FBI agent working the case, Special Agent Thomas Lindstrom, recognized the man's face. Lindstrom had previously worked background investigations for security clearances and remembered processing a clearance review for someone who resembled the man in the photograph. A search of FBI security clearance files produced a match. The man's name was Jonathan Michael Barrett. He was 41 years old, lived in Westchester County, north of New York City, and worked as a senior engineer at a defense contractor called Aerodynamic Systems Corporation, based in White Plains, New York. The company specialized in developing guidance systems for missiles and aircraft, working under classified contracts with the Department of Defense and NASA. Barrett had held a top-secret security clearance since 1975 and had access to some of the most sensitive military technology being developed in the United States. The initials matched. JM could easily represent Jonathan Michael Barrett. The professional background matched. The notebook's references to highly classified documents and technical specifications fit with Barrett's access to classified defense information. The geographic proximity matched. Barrett lived and worked in the New York metropolitan area, making regular meetings with Petrov feasible. The FBI immediately opened an intensive investigation of Jonathan Barrett. Surveillance teams were assigned to document his activities. His financial records were subpoenaed. His work computer access logs were obtained with the cooperation of Aerodynamic Systems Corporation's security officials. His telephone calls were monitored under warrant. The investigation of Barrett revealed a man who appeared, on the surface, entirely ordinary. He had been born in 1940 in Syracuse, New York, had attended Cornell University, where he earned a degree in electrical engineering, had married his college girlfriend Linda in 1963, and had 2 children, a son named David, born in 1965, and a daughter named Rebecca, born in 1968. The family lived in a 4-bedroom house in Scarsdale, a wealthy suburb known for its excellent schools and comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle. Barrett's annual salary was approximately $85,000, which, combined with his wife Linda's income from her work as a real estate agent, placed the family comfortably in the upper tier of American household incomes. They belonged to a country club, took vacation trips to Florida and California, and by all external measures lived the prosperous suburban life that defined the American upper-middle class in 1981. But the investigation also revealed troubling financial patterns. Despite the family's substantial income, Barrett had significant personal debts. He had taken out a second mortgage on the Scarsdale house in 1978. He had outstanding credit card balances totaling more than $30,000. He had borrowed money from his brother-in-law in 1979. The financial pressure provided a motive for espionage. If Barrett had been approached by Soviet intelligence and offered money for classified information, his debt burden might have made the offer attractive despite his comfortable lifestyle and professional success. On April 9, 1981, 32 days after the notebook had been seized, the FBI felt it had sufficient evidence to make arrests. The decision was made to arrest Jonathan Barrett first, before moving against other individuals who might be identified from the notebook. The hope was that Barrett, when confronted with the evidence, might cooperate and provide information that would help identify others in the network and understand the full scope of the espionage operation. Barrett was arrested at his home on the morning of April 9, 1981, at approximately 6:30 a.m. FBI agents executed a search warrant simultaneously with the arrest, searching the house while Barrett was taken into custody. Linda Barrett and the 2 children, David, then 16, and Rebecca, then 13, were present during the arrest. According to the FBI's report, Linda Barrett became hysterical when agents informed her that her husband was being arrested for espionage. She insisted there must be a mistake, that her husband was a loyal American, that the agents must have confused him with someone else. David and Rebecca, awakened by the commotion, came downstairs to find their father in handcuffs, their mother crying, and FBI agents searching their home. The search of the Barrett residence produced significant evidence. In Barrett's home office, agents found documents that should not have been in his possession, classified technical specifications for a missile guidance system that Barrett had photographed at his workplace and brought home. They found a microdot reader, a specialized optical device used to read miniaturized photographs. They found $8,400 in cash hidden in a locked box in the garage. And they found a second notebook, smaller than Petrov's, but similar in structure, containing Barrett's own records of his meetings with Petrov, including dates, locations, and amounts received. Barrett was transported to the FBI's New York field office and advised of his rights. Initially, he exercised his right to remain silent and requested an attorney, but after consulting with his court-appointed lawyer, Barrett made the decision to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a recommended reduced sentence. beginning on April 11, 1981. Barrett participated in a series of debriefing sessions with FBI agents that would continue for 3 weeks. According to Barrett's debriefings, he had first been approached by Soviet intelligence in March 1979, approximately 2 years before his arrest. The approach had been made not by Petrov directly, but by someone Barrett knew only as Michael, a man who had struck up a conversation with Barrett at a technical conference in Boston. Michael had expressed interest in Barrett's work and had suggested meeting for dinner during the conference. Over drinks and conversation, Michael had discussed political topics, expressing criticism of American foreign policy and sympathy for Soviet positions. He had subtly suggested that sharing technical information with Soviet engineers could contribute to international scientific cooperation and reduce Cold War tensions. Barrett acknowledged that he had understood from the beginning that Michael was likely connected to Soviet intelligence, but he had rationalized his decision to provide information by telling himself that he was only sharing technical details that Soviet engineers could eventually figure out on their own, that nothing he provided would genuinely harm American security, and that the money he received was justified compensation for his expertise and risk. The relationship had developed gradually. Michael had requested specific types of information, technical drawings, specifications, test data, performance parameters. Barrett had photographed documents at his workplace using a camera Michael had provided. They had met every few weeks, usually in Manhattan or other New York locations, following what Barrett described as careful security protocols. In the summer of 1979, Michael had introduced Barrett to Petrov, explaining that Petrov would be Barrett's primary contact going forward. Petrov had been professional, careful, and organized. He had provided Barrett with a payment schedule and guidelines for the types of information most valuable. He had reassured Barrett multiple times that their work was important for peace, that it helped Soviet leaders understand American capabilities and reduced the risk of miscalculation. Barrett estimated that over approximately 2 years, from March 1979 to March 1981, he had provided Soviet intelligence with classified information on at least 6 separate weapons systems and technologies. The FBI's damage assessment, completed in May 1981, concluded that Barrett's espionage had compromised multiple defense programs and had given the Soviet Union significant advantages in understanding and potentially countering U.S. military capabilities, particularly in the area of missile guidance systems. With Barrett's cooperation, the FBI was able to identify other individuals referenced in Petrov's notebook. Barrett provided physical descriptions and, in some cases, first names or identifying details about people he had seen at meetings with Petrov or whom Michael or Petrov had mentioned. This information, combined with continued analysis of the notebook and surveillance photographs, led to the identification of at least 4 additional individuals who appeared to be part of Petrov's network. The second arrest came on April 23, 1981. The target was Raymond Kenneth Hoffman, a 38-year-old analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C. The notebook entries designated RK matched Hoffman based on surveillance photographs from meetings in Manhattan on dates corresponding to notebook entries. Hoffman had top-secret clearance and access to intelligence assessments about Soviet military capabilities. He was arrested at his office in the morning. A search of his residence in Arlington, Virginia, produced classified documents he had removed from his workplace. Hoffman initially denied everything, insisting the FBI had made a terrible mistake, but confronted with photographs of him meeting Petrov, with notebook entries documenting those meetings, and with classified documents found in his home, Hoffman eventually admitted to providing information to Soviet intelligence. According to his limited debriefings, he had been recruited in late 1979 and had provided intelligence assessments and analysis for approximately 18 months. His motivation, he claimed, had been primarily financial. He had gambling debts and had seen espionage as a way to solve his money problems. The third arrest came on May 7, 1981. The target was Patricia Ann Morrison, a 45-year-old secretary at the State Department in Washington, D.C. She worked in the Bureau of European Affairs and had access to diplomatic cables and policy documents related to U.S.-Soviet relations. The notebook entries designated PM matched Morrison based on analysis of her access. Her travel records showing trips to New York on dates matching notebook entries, and financial records showing unexplained cash deposits. Morrison was arrested at her home in suburban Maryland in the early morning. Morrison's response to arrest was one of complete emotional collapse. According to FBI reports, she became almost catatonic during initial questioning, unable or unwilling to speak. After several days, she began cooperating, describing how she had been recruited in early 1980 by someone she knew only as Peter, how she had provided copies of diplomatic cables and policy documents, how she had rationalized her actions by telling herself she was only providing information that would eventually become public anyway. She expressed profound remorse and repeatedly asked what would happen to her. The fourth arrest came on May 19, 1981. The target was David Lawrence Chen, a 33-year-old research scientist at a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey that had contracts with the Department of Defense to develop chemical and biological defense countermeasures. The notebook entries designated DC matched Chen based on technical details in the entries that corresponded to Chen's research area. Chen was arrested at his workplace in the afternoon. A search of his apartment produced classified research documents and laboratory notes. Chen cooperated extensively from the beginning. He described being recruited in mid-1979, shortly after beginning his work on classified projects. His recruiter, whom he knew only as Alex, had approached him at a scientific conference and had gradually drawn him into providing information. Chen claimed his motivation had been partly financial, but also partly ideological. He had opposed U.S. development of chemical and biological weapons and had convinced himself that sharing information with Soviet scientists was morally justified. With these four individuals arrested and cooperating to varying degrees, the FBI had effectively dismantled what the notebook revealed to be a significant Soviet intelligence network. But the notebook suggested there might be others. Certain entries could not be definitively matched to identified individuals. Some initials and code designators remained mysterious. The FBI continued to investigate, but as months passed without additional breakthroughs, the investigation's focus shifted from identifying new targets to building the legal cases against those already arrested. The legal proceedings moved forward through the summer and fall of 1981. Jonathan Barrett was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage and with unauthorized communication of national defense information. The charges carried potential sentences of up to life imprisonment. On June 18, 1981, Barrett appeared in federal court in Manhattan and, following his attorney's advice, pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with prosecutors. On August 27, 1981, he was sentenced by Judge Patricia Wald to 18 years in federal prison. Raymond Hoffman pleaded guilty on July 9, 1981, and was sentenced on September 15, 1981, to 15 years in federal prison. Patricia Morrison pleaded guilty on July 23, 1981, and was sentenced on October 6, 1981 to 12 years in federal prison. David Chen pleaded guilty on August 4th, 1981, and was sentenced on October 20th, 1981, to 14 years in federal prison. The sentences reflected both the seriousness of espionage and the cooperation provided by each defendant. Federal prosecutors had recommended reduced sentences for all four in recognition of their cooperation and their expressed remorse. The judges, in their sentencing remarks, acknowledged the cooperation but emphasized that espionage remained one of the most serious crimes against national security and that significant punishment was necessary both for justice and deterrence. For the families of the four arrested individuals, the impact was immediate and devastating. Linda Barrett filed for divorce in September 1981, 5 months after her husband's arrest. Court records indicate the divorce was finalized in March 1982. She sold the house in Scarsdale. It had to be sold to pay legal fees and satisfy debts, and moved with David and Rebecca to a smaller house in a less expensive neighborhood. She struggled to find work because potential employers viewed her as a security risk due to her former husband's espionage conviction. She eventually found employment as an administrative assistant at a medical practice, earning approximately 1/3 of what she and Jonathan had earned combined. David Barrett, 16 years old when his father was arrested, struggled profoundly with the revelation. He had looked up to his father, had viewed him as successful and admirable, had aspired to follow a similar career path in engineering. The arrest shattered that image and left David confused about who his father really was. His academic performance declined dramatically. He began having trouble at school, getting into fights, skipping classes. According to school counselors' records obtained years later by researchers, David exhibited signs of depression and anger that were clearly related to his father's arrest, but that he was unable or unwilling to discuss. By his early 20s, David had developed substance abuse problems that he would struggle with for years. He drifted between jobs, unable to establish a stable career or personal life. His relationship with his father remained distant and strained, marked by anger and confusion that never fully resolved. Rebecca Barrett, 13 years old at the time of the arrest, had less clear understanding of what her father had done, but felt the consequences just as acutely. Other children at school knew about her father's arrest. It had been covered extensively in local and national news, and some avoided her or made cruel comments. She became withdrawn and isolated. Her mother, struggling with her own trauma and trying to manage practical challenges of the divorce and financial difficulties, had limited emotional resources to help Rebecca process what was happening. Rebecca eventually went to college and became a social worker, a career choice she later described as influenced by her own experience of trauma and her desire to help others who had suffered. Her relationship with her father was cordial but distant. She visited him occasionally in prison and maintained contact after his release, but they never recaptured the closeness they had once shared. Raymond Hoffman had been married to his wife Margaret for 11 years at the time of his arrest. They had no children. Margaret had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities and was stunned by his arrest. She stood by him initially, visiting him in jail and attending his court hearings. But the pressure of the scandal, combined with her feeling of betrayal at having been deceived about such a fundamental aspect of her husband's life, led her to file for divorce in October 1981. The divorce was finalized in February 1982. Margaret declined all interview requests and moved away from the Washington area, seeking to escape the association with her former husband's crimes. Patricia Morrison had been divorced for 8 years at the time of her arrest. She had 2 adult children from her previous marriage, a son and daughter in their early 20s. Both were shocked by their mother's arrest and struggled to understand how someone they viewed as conventional and risk-averse could have committed espionage. According to later accounts, both children initially cut off contact with their mother, feeling betrayed and ashamed. Over time, the daughter partially reconciled with Patricia, visiting her occasionally in prison. The son never reconciled and declined to have any relationship with his mother after her conviction. David Chen was unmarried at the time of his arrest. He had been engaged to be married to a woman named Jennifer, with whom he had been in a relationship for 3 years. Jennifer broke off the engagement within days of Chen's arrest, unable to reconcile her image of the man she had planned to marry with the reality of his espionage activities. Chen's parents, immigrants from Hong Kong who had worked hard to provide their son with educational opportunities leading to his scientific career, were devastated by his arrest. According to later interviews, they felt profound shame in their community and struggled to understand how their son, whom they had raised to value integrity and achievement, could have betrayed his country. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the 4 convicted spies and their families. At Aerodynamic Systems Corporation, where Barrett had worked, the company implemented extensive security reviews and new protocols for handling classified information. Several employees were required to undergo additional background investigations. The atmosphere at the company became one of suspicion and surveillance, with employees feeling they were under constant scrutiny. Morale declined, and several key engineers left the company for positions elsewhere. At the Defense Intelligence Agency, where Hoffman had worked, similar security reviews disrupted normal operations. The revelation that someone with Hoffman's access and position had been compromised led to a comprehensive reassessment of who had access to what information. Dozens of employees found their clearances suspended pending review. Projects were delayed. The agency's credibility within the broader intelligence community suffered. At the State Department, Morrison's espionage led to reviews of diplomatic security and handling of classified cables. The fact that a secretary, even one with significant seniority and access, had been able to remove documents and provide them to foreign intelligence raised questions about document control procedures. New protocols were implemented, including more frequent inventories of classified materials and more restrictions on who could access certain documents. The pharmaceutical company where Chen had worked lost its defense contracts. The Department of Defense concluded that the compromise of Chen's research and the company's failure to detect his removal of classified materials meant the company could not be trusted with sensitive projects. The loss of contracts led to layoffs of approximately 40 employees who had worked on the A classified programs. Viktor Petrov, whose notebook had enabled the entire operation, remained in the Soviet Union. He never returned to the United States. American intelligence agencies believed he continued to work for the KGB, possibly in operational planning or training roles, but his specific activities after 1981 are not documented in available records. The notebook itself became something of a legend within American counterintelligence circles. It was classified top secret and stored in secure facilities, but information about its existence and its role in dismantling a Soviet spy network circulated within the intelligence community. It was cited in training programs as an example of how proper operational security requires discipline and how even sophisticated intelligence officers can make mistakes that compromise their networks. The fact that Petrov had maintained such detailed written records, contrary to basic espionage tradecraft, which emphasized minimizing documentation, became a case study in how human nature, even among trained intelligence professionals, can lead to operational errors. Dr. Martin Reeves, who had led the cryptanalysis team that decrypted the notebook, received commendations from both the FBI and the CIA for his work on the case. He continued working on counterintelligence cryptanalysis until his retirement from the FBI in 1989. In interviews he gave after retiring, he emphasized that the notebook's decryption, while technically challenging, had ultimately been possible because Petrov had used what was essentially a homemade code system rather than a sophisticated cipher. A properly designed one-time pad or modern encryption system would have been far more difficult to break. Petrov's reliance on location abbreviations, recognizable initials, and straightforward numerical notations had made the task feasible. Catherine Brennan, the FBI agent who had found the notebook during the search of Petrov's apartment, continued working Soviet counterintelligence cases until 1986, when she transferred to white-collar crime investigations. In later interviews, she reflected on the randomness of the discovery, how the notebook had been in a drawer that might easily have been searched by another agent, how Petrov might have destroyed it before departing for Moscow, how the investigation's success had depended on multiple elements coming together at the right time. Jonathan Barrett served 14 years of his 18-year sentence before being released on parole in 1995. He was 55 years old. By that time, the Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had dissolved, and the world he had spied for no longer existed. He moved to Florida and took a job doing technical writing for a small engineering firm, work that required no security clearance and paid modestly. His relationship with his children remained strained. David, who had struggled with substance abuse problems in his 20s, maintained minimal contact with his father. Rebecca, who had become a social worker, had slightly more contact but described their relationship as cordial rather than close. Linda, who had reverted to her maiden name after the divorce, never spoke to Jonathan again after 1982. Raymond Hoffman served 12 years before being released on parole in 1993. He was 50 years old. He moved to Nevada and worked at a series of low-paying jobs, warehouse work, retail, security that were the only employment available to someone with a federal espionage conviction. He never remarried. He lived alone in a small apartment and had few friends. In 2008, he died of a heart attack at the age of 65. His obituary made no mention of his espionage conviction. Patricia Morrison served 9 years before being released on parole in 1990. She was 54 years old. She moved to Oregon, changing her name legally to distance herself from her past. She found work as a clerk at a law firm and lived quietly. Her daughter visited occasionally. Her son never did. In 2012, Patricia died of cancer at the age of 76. According to her daughter's later account, Patricia had expressed deep remorse for her espionage throughout her remaining years, describing it as the great mistake of her life that had destroyed her family relationships. David Chen served 11 years before being released on parole in 1992. He was 44 years old. He could not work in scientific research due to his conviction and became a high school science teacher in California. He never married and lived alone. According to later interviews, he maintained that while he accepted responsibility for his actions, he still believed that sharing scientific information could sometimes serve peaceful purposes. This rationalization suggested he had not fully grasped the seriousness of what he had done. Chen died in 2019 at the age of 71. The question of Viktor Petrov's fate remained largely unknown to American intelligence agencies. Reports suggested he had continued working for the KGB and later for its successor agencies after the Soviet Union's collapse. In 2007, A Russian journalist investigating Cold War espionage operations reported that Petrov had died in Moscow in 2003 at the age of 65, but this could not be independently confirmed. If the report was accurate, Petrov died without ever facing American justice for his role in recruiting and handling American citizens who betrayed their country. The broader question raised by the Notebook case is how to assess responsibility when multiple parties share culpability. Viktor Petrov recruited and handled American intelligence assets, but he was operating within a Soviet system that valued intelligence collection and treated human assets as tools. Jonathan Barrett, Raymond Hoffman, Patricia Morrison, and David Chen chose to commit espionage, but they made those choices within contexts of financial pressure, ideological confusion, professional ambition, and personal vulnerabilities that Soviet intelligence deliberately exploited. The legal system treated the case as straightforward. The four Americans had violated clear laws against espionage, had provided classified information to a foreign power, and deserved significant punishment. From a legal perspective, this was correct. But from a human perspective, the case revealed the complexity of how intelligence operations work, how they identify vulnerable individuals, how they gradually compromise them, how they provide rationalizations that make betrayal seem acceptable or even noble. All four convicted Americans expressed remorse, but the genuineness of that remorse varied. Barrett seemed to understand that he had betrayed his country and destroyed his family for money and ego gratification, dressed up as political conviction. Hoffman seemed to view his espionage more pragmatically, as a criminal act motivated by gambling debts and a need for money. Morrison seemed genuinely traumatized by what she had done and the consequences it had caused. Chen seemed to retain some of his ideological rationalizations even while acknowledging wrongdoing. For the children affected by the case, David and Rebecca Barrett, Patricia Morrison's adult children, and others connected to the convicted spies, the impact lasted far longer than the prison sentences. Growing up or living with the knowledge that a parent had committed espionage created profound identity challenges. How does one reconcile childhood memories of a loving parent with the reality of that parent's betrayal? How does one develop one's own sense of loyalty and integrity when a parent has violated both? How does one cope with the shame of association with espionage in communities where that association matters? These questions had no easy answers. The children and family members of the convicted spies carried burdens they did not choose and did not deserve. They were secondary victims of espionage, people whose lives were disrupted not because of their own choices, but because of someone else's. Decisions made in secret. The notebook that Catherine Brennan found in Viktor Petrov's apartment on March 8, 1981, documented approximately 200 meetings over 2 years. It led to 4 arrests and 4 convictions. It resulted in approximately 60 years of combined prison sentences. It destroyed at least 4 marriages and damaged the lives of at least a dozen children. It compromised classified information that took years and billions of dollars to develop. It provided America's adversary with intelligence that shaped Soviet military planning during the final decade of the Cold War. But the notebook could not capture the human dimensions of what it documented. It could not capture Viktor Petrov's calculations as he recruited vulnerable Americans. It could not capture Jonathan Barrett's rationalizations as he photographed classified documents. It could not capture Linda Barrett's shock when FBI agents arrived at her door. It could not capture David Barrett's confusion about who his father really was. It could not capture Patricia Morrison's collapse under the weight of her guilt. It could not capture the fear, shame, regret, and loss that radiated outward from the spy network it documented. Those human dimensions existed in conversations never recorded, in emotions never articulated, in consequences that unfolded over decades. The notebook was evidence, history, a map of betrayal. But it was also incomplete, capturing only the operational surface of events whose real meaning lay in the lives it touched and the damage it left behind. Jonathan Barrett was 41 years old when he first appeared in Viktor Petrov's notebook in April 1979. He was 59 when he was released from prison in 1995. He was 74 when he died in 2014, largely estranged from his children and living alone in a small Florida apartment. The years in between were shaped by choices he made in secret, documented in a notebook he never saw, discovered by an FBI agent he never met, decrypted by cryptanalysts he never knew, presented as evidence in a courtroom where his life was judged and found wanting. And in all those years, he struggled to answer the question of why he had done it. Not the rationalizations he had given himself at the time or the explanations he offered investigators, but the real reason, the truth beneath the lies he had told himself and others. That answer, if he ever found it, died with him, leaving only the facts documented in a notebook found in a Queens apartment on a morning in March 1981, when everything came undone.